Hello, this is Tom Sargent, and today I'm going to talk about the history of macroeconomics, or actually a part of it. So let's get started. There's basically two major parts of macroeconomics. And first involves growth, and the second involves business cycles. And they're actually tied together. But today I'm going to talk about business cycles, and hopefully we'll see why. So the origins of the subject, I think of it being in the 19th century, when we have to remember there were very smart people, very good observers. They didn't have the tools that we have today, and that's going to be one of my themes. So in the 19th century, kind of a big fact that motivated serious observers was that there were business cycles and there were booms and depressions, and they seemed to be getting more and more severe. The evidence of this was impressionistic, not completely systematic, fragmentary observations of, that you could see when you walk down the streets of a big city of distress. They seem to be getting worse. And Karl Marx, who was an astute observer of these things, thought that he saw them getting worse, and he thought that this was going to doom capitalism. As a scientific proposition, he thought there was something inherent in the dynamics of a market economy with private property and markets as the organizing principle that would make these depressions worse and worse. And he wrote about this, synthesizing what he thought were going to be observations. He was a very good economist in the classical tradition of Smith and Ricardo. He wrote about this not using mathematics, but using sophisticated verbal arguments. So he said he had theories about the falling profit rate, that through the internal logic we're going to destroy market economies. For a time, it looked like his predictions might be right. In the 1890s, there was a very bad depression in Europe and the Americas. A lot of discontent, a lot of businesses closed, a lot of unemployment. And then there was a tremendously bad depression from 1929 to 1939, the so-called Great Depression. We're talking about that. And there, a number of observers thought that this was the ultimate confirmation of Marx's prediction. And it shook market economies in the Western world to their foundations. So we're going to come back to Marx's prediction because it's going to play an important role. So the work in the 19th century, I'm going to call it pre-scientific, not to disparage it, but to characterize it. And I'm calling it pre-scientific for a couple of reasons. There was very limited data, and there was not, in terms of business cycles, there's not what today we would recognize as a coherent theory. And I'll put my cards on the table. Our tool for checking coherence internal coherence of a theory is mathematics. And these 19th century theories were, for the most part, not put together as coherent theories. They were clever, they had lots of insights, but whether or not they hung together really couldn't be verified. So now we're going to go to the 20th century. And essentially, macroeconomics is in some ways is a formal part. It's a formal theory. It's new, relatively new in terms of the suite, and it's a child of the mid 20th century. Okay, and by a scientific theory, the 20th century has taught us it's going to have several components. One is going to be measurement, something the 19th century didn't really have. So measurement, data assembling, and data description. It's pure observation. It's what the great astronomer Kepler was doing, looking at the data, trying to characterize it from stars. He had lots of planets, trying to make sense of those data. Well, lots of big effort in the 20th century was to figure out some measurements that were going to allow you to talk about business cycles in a systematic way. And then the next is, once you had those measurements, what are you going to make of them? So a theory in terms of things that would be recognized by an economist, demand curves, supply curves, the preferences and technologies that lie underneath demand and supply curves. And then the third component, which I'm elevating to be equal, because you can't do measurement and you can't do theory unless you have tools. And one reason that things were able to be done in the 20th century is the tools that were available in the 20th century were much better than in the 19th century. So the 19th century tools are basically words and logic. Basically English or Chinese or French. 20th century tools are mathematics, statistics, probability theory, and computers. And some of the statistics and probability theory in particular, and parts of the mathematics that were going to be applied to solve macroeconomic problems didn't exist in the 19th century. And we'll come back to that. Okay, so I want to start by asking kind of what are the questions, the questions that the subject of macroeconomics, of business cycles, of recessions and depressions, booms, what are the questions? So the first question is, so think about this. Why don't this economies consist of many firms, many people, many activities. There's lots of shocks hitting things. There's weather shocks. There's health shocks, as we know now, but we'll come back to that. So why don't these micro shocks just average out? Like we have law of statistics, the law of large numbers. Why don't they just average out to be a constant? And why don't they average out like every period to be the same constant? So there's shocks that affect the demand for one commodity relative to another, but why don't they just average out so that there doesn't seem to be some kind of aggregate shock? So there must be something that's fighting a law of large numbers. And this is a question that some very good young people are addressing today. Okay, so then if they don't average out and there's some aggregate shock, that's their second question. Well, what are they? Are they so-called real shocks of the kind that maybe Solow and Prescott have stressed in some of their work? Are they real shocks? Are they monetary shocks? Are they somehow shocks that are somehow either put in there by something that happens in the credit and monetary system, or that's either put in by policymakers somewhere or else by something inherent in the financial system. What are they? So that's one of our key questions. And then the next question is, well, how should you even describe a business cycle? So you and I might have firm ideas about this, but we're the beneficiaries of this wonderful research that was done in the 20th century. But at the beginning of the 20th century is, well, how should you measure it? You've got fragmentary witnesses to the business cycle from all sorts of series. How should you summarize the data? You just can't dump all the data and keep track of them all at once. Somehow you have to summarize them. You need some data reduction, data summary. Now, nowadays, machine learning is all about that. But there were no machines and no computers of the kind that did that, and there were much less data around. Then here's a big question that we're going to come back to. Can governments do anything to prevent or at least moderate business cycles, recessions? Can governments do anything? Now, this is at the core of the question that Marx raised, the serious question. Is a market economy kind of doomed by its inherent characteristics, or is there anything that can be done to repair the patient and basically keep them healthy? And then the final thing is, how are price level movements associated with business cycles? Do they have anything to do with business cycles? Or are they at the core of the business cycle? A great business cycle theorist of the early 20th century, Irving Fisher, said, he wrote a paper saying, the business cycle was the dance of the dollar, all connected with price level movements. That's what he thought. But other people think differently. So this is still, these are first-class questions. They're enduring questions, and they're vital. And they've attracted some of the some wonderful minds in the 20th century, and they still do today. So I'm gonna talk about measurement and theory and tell you kind of the history of it. And so put yourself in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, and you kind of you have these ideas. Marx wrote 1860, 1870. So people are writing about business cycles in words, but they don't have many numbers. So now there's two really impressive issues and research efforts, and these are all about measurement. And one comes from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was the NBER, which is now in Cambridge. It used to be in New York. The key thing was Burns and Mitchell. Wesley Clare Mitchell and his student Arthur Burns. So their idea was they're going to go no holds barred. They're going to have no presumption about a theory. They just want to measure the disease. So they go get observations on everything they can. Production of pig iron, that was one of theirs. Production of various agricultural products. Fragmentary measures of prices of various kinds. So they'll literally get tens and scores and hundreds of measures, and they'll get time series of them. Pig iron production monthly or quarterly. They want at least quarterly. They get all these data, and they want to organize them. And what they're looking for is, in all these data, they somehow want to put them in bins and see if they can spot any patterns for them. So they struggled for years, and they came up with a methodology of grouping the series in certain ways and then taking certain averages. And they took averages of certain sets of data across time, and basically they took averages at a point in time of a bunch of stuff, and then sometimes they smoothed those averages over time and stared at them. And by systematically doing this, they ended up, they had a graphical procedure. They took out trends. They had to think about taking trends out because they didn't want to focus on growth. They wanted to figure out the cycle. So they had these adjustment procedures, and they presented things in graphs. And what they detected is they detected patterns when that seemed to be very similar across very different business cycles. So they conjured up a notion of various kinds of averages, and they came up with these National Bureau of Economics business cycle dating procedures. And they're the product of some judgment and immense averages across a whole bunch of series. That's what they did. And this activity remains an ongoing procedure on to today. And essentially the way to think of it, Burns and Mitchell were doing machine learning by hand and in their heads. They were looking for patterns. And they actually stumbled across something that was very close to something that hadn't been invented yet. It's a factor model. It's a model that a whole bunch of time series their common variation is all being intermediated through one or two small number of factors. And you can think of the factor thereafter as the business cycle. And they actually did, in their way, a pretty ingenious way of getting at this factor. So that's one thing they did. Here's another. So that's Burns and Mitchell. So those data were there. What actually turned out to be more influential was work by Simon Kuznick and Richard Stone, who what they did is they wanted to use a little bit of theory, actually not much, and come up with something called national income and product accounts. So they wanted to think about you can think about a business as an income and statement. They wanted to generalize that to have a sources of income and sources of expenditure statement for a whole country. They want to add up a whole bunch of stuff. So they created, from brand new, these accounts for a whole country. The United States, in one case with Kuznets, and Richard Stone, Great Britain. And essentially what they did is, they did this both on the product side and the income side. They said, well, they defined something called, GNP. That's where this came from. And they broke it into components, mutually exclusive components. GNP is equal to consumption. They had a definition of consumption. What kind of economic activities are consumption? What's investment? Things used to augment capital stocks. Government's purchases, exports, and imports. So I've written as C, I, G, X, and M. That's in a lot of economics books. So they organized accounts and kind of year by year at the beginning, eventually quarter by quarter. They got measures of consumption, investment, government expenditures, exports, imports, and they actually eventually you disaggregate that: consumption, durable consumption, non-durable consumption, services. So they basically created these components, and they just created the accounts and looked at them. And this is a candy store for business cycle theorists, because now you could actually see not only in an organized way, you could see income going up and down, national income, and you could see which was when there was a recession, which went down more, consumption or investment or government expenditures. Okay, so they took these measures. And then the final thing is going on around the same time is Irving Fisher, building on work of other people, is getting price indices. Is the price, defining a notion of a price index and asking, how is it moving? Fisher was very concerned that price movements would cause redistributions of wealth if, depending on how contracts were denominated, and that could have big effects on the business cycle. Okay, so that's all measurement. Now let's go to theory. It's going to be our main thing we'll talk about from now on, but it's going to be very much based on the measurements, because a good way to think of Keynes is, he wrote this book called A General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, 1936. You could ask yourself, it's a very bold, why did he use the term general theory? Why did he title general theory? Well, Keynes was great at public relations. Well, scratch your head. Was there any other work recently published called the general theory? And the answer is yeah. It's Einstein's paper on the general theory of relativity. And Keynes is sending a message. I'm generalizing an earlier theory just the way Einstein did. That's the way I read him. That's where I hear him. So what's Keynes's idea? He's going to take the national income and product accounts that are sitting there that Kuznets prepared. He knows about those. And remember, the national income and products accounts, they have a C, they have an I. He knows Irving Fisher is concerned about the price level. Okay, so he's going to take those down, and he's going to, what Keynes actually, the way to read his book is he's going to write down a decision rule, an economy-wide decision rule for consumption, investment, and the demand for money. I'm written at MD. He's going to write those down. Now, that is bold and heroic for reasons that we're going to, talk about the next few minutes. For C, he writes down something called a consumption function. And where does he get it from? He gets it from, a lot's from introspection, his experience. Keynes is in his mid-50s. He's seen a lot. He's thought a lot. He's going to write down an investment function. He's going to say investment depends on some things. He's going to have it depend on the interest rate in a big way and on some expectations about things in the future. Consumption, he's going to have that depend on disposable income. He's going to make that up. He's actually going to reason as if it's a very simple linear function, a constant plus a slope times income. That's his consumption function. Demand function for money, he's going to tell you it depends on the price level, the interest rate, and either consumption or output. And he's basically going to write down functions. And I'm going to call these things decision rules because that's what they are. They're theories about the decisions that people in the aggregate are choosing that are going to determine the elements of Simon Kuznets' national income accounts. That's what he's doing. As he wants to theorize not in a vacuum about it, but about the objects that are really in those income accounts. And why? Because he wants to build a theory of what's making income around. And one thing that he's going to do is he's going to not have a theory of G. He's going to have that exogenous because he wants to move it around to make policy recommendations. And we're going to talk about that. So this is heroic because how did Keynes get theories of those decision rules? Well, what he did is he reasoned informally, intuitively, alluding to various forces that he thought shaped those decisions. That's what he's doing. And his discussions of those forces are they're challenging to read, but they're full of insights. He has in mind that all of these decisions, all three of these, consumption, investment, and liquidity, preference, demand for money, they all depend on dynamics. That is, you're making decisions now that are going to have consequences for you in the future. but you don't know the future when you make those decisions. So somehow beliefs about the future, your beliefs about the future are going to influence those dynamics. But there's no really good theories about the beliefs about the future around. So Keynes is going to make up some shrewd observations and bring them into his descriptions. Uncertainty, what are those? That's when you make decisions now, you don't know how things are going to come out. When you produce things of your firm, you don't know the demand that's going to be there in the future. You don't know what competition is going to come up with. There's unresolved, unforeseen contingencies that affect how your current decisions might work out. So Keynes thought these were really important ingredients into the consumption, investment, and liquidity preference decision. And he wrote down, told you how he thought they'd work out. And partly he's bluffing, partly he's guessing. So here's Keynes's problem. He has a huge problem, a scientific, intellectual problem when he's doing this work. And you have to admire and sympathize with him. He wanted to say, he wrote this book in the middle of the Depression, where, the economies of throughout Western Europe, his own country, Great Britain, the United States, France, certainly Germany, are all in crisis. He wanted to say something constructive about the decisions about consumption, investment, demand for money, and other things, but he didn't know. He wanted to write down decisions, but he didn't know modern decision theory. Why not? Why didn't he know modern decision theory? The answer is, in 1936, most of it had not been invented. And the little that had been, Keynes seemed not to recognize its usefulness or not to know. So there's a bunch of tools that could have helped Keynes, but he didn't know them. He didn't have them. One's the calculus of variations, which was around, but he didn't use. His friend Frank Ramsey did. Things that weren't around were the Wiener-Kolmogorov prediction theory, a theory of optimal prediction of an uncertain time series. That's invented basically during World War II, 1940s. Dynamic programming, formulation of optimization problems in a very shrewd, recursive way. That's not invented till the 50s and 60s. Macroeconomists didn't get their hands on it until the 70s and 80s. De Finetti's probability theory, that was in 1936, but Keynes either didn't know about it or didn't recognize it. Maybe it was in Italian. Von Neumann and Morgenstern's theory of games, 1944. Expected utility theory is brought in. Keynes didn't have it. The econometrics of simultaneous equations, it hadn't been invented. It was invented in the late 40s and the 50s, really refined in the 60s. So what did Keynes do? He wants to say something about these decisions, but he doesn't have the tools. So what's he going to do? So what he did is he struggled, he guessed, he used all of his cleverness, he used the English language, he used a little bit of math, high school math. He had geometric series. 1 over 1 minus b is equal to 1 plus b squared plus forever. That's the multiplier. So you could ask, well, why didn't Keynes wait? He surely had some sense that he was short of the tools. So why was he in such a hurry? And here's going to be a key message of this little idiosyncratic, really personal history of macroeconomics and business cycles. Why was he in a hurry? It's because he wanted to give a constructive response to Marx's challenge. Remember, Marx predicted that business cycles were going to cause an end to the capitalist system. And Keynes liked the capitalist system. He was a classical liberal. He liked the way markets worked. He admired what they achieved. So he wanted to give a constructive response to Marx's challenge. That is, he wanted to provide a theoretical justification for some recommendations for a government to use fiscal policy to tame depressions and strengthen market economies. That's what he wanted to do. And he actually had a prescription that he had endorsed before he wrote this book. And it was a theory that it was a prescription that had been circulating both in England and in the United States. And here's what Keynes's ultimate prescription for a national government to fight depressions is. He wrote this down very clearly before he wrote the general theory, and he had given this advice to the government. But he did not, at the time that he gave this, he did not have a firmly worked out theory, which he wrote in the general theory. So what was his prescription? And think about this for today. So the idea is that what he said is the government should keep two budgets. Every government, the national government should keep, it should have a current account budget and it should have a capital account budget. So it should have two accounts, current account and capital account. What current account is expenditures that go out the window and don't generate any future revenues or future capital-like things. Capital account is public works projects, dams, roads, airports, with ports that generate physical capital and prospective revenues like tolls and fees for using them. So he said keep two budgets, and then he said his advice was on the current account budget, always balance it. Whatever you spend, you should have the revenues, tax revenues to do it. So you always run a balanced budget on the current account. So when people say Keynes was in favor of big deficits, that's kind of slandering Keynes. That's not what he said. You can't find it in the general theory, and you can find what I'm reporting in his, I think it's a 1928 or 29 document where he gives his recommendations. So then the second thing, so you always run a current account balanced budget. And then what you should do is you should run capital account deficits during depressions. We should use, and what do you do it for? Public works. Use public works to fight the depression. That's a good time to build public works. And there were other people who were proposing that. Two Americans, Foster and Ketchings, were proposing that in the 1920s. It attracted some attention from both Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. And Milton Friedman actually endorsed that recommendation in 1949. It's exactly Keynes's proposal. Okay, so we had this is what Keynes did. He made some guesses, came up with this description. He thought his guesses rationalized, justified his recommendations. Okay, so now we get to what we want to talk about. What were the responses, the scientific and intellectual response to Keynes's 1936 general theory? And there were a number of them. So I'll go through these. And while it may seem that you may hear me being critical or reporting other people being critical, but I think it's critical in the most complementary sense to Keynes. The first thing is, you can test for this for yourself. Keynes's book, 36, it's very difficult to read because there's too little math. There's a lot of ambiguity and possibly incoherence because there's too little math. So some very smart economists who were they were very young at the time. They were attracted to Keynes's arguments, but couldn't understand it. So what they did is they undertook to use some math to translate Keynes's words in the math. Hicks, in his famous paper on ISLM in 1937, Franco Modigliani in 44, they wrote down small several equation systems, simultaneous equation systems that had Keynesian-like decision rules, just like he had, but it was all written down. And then they solved for national income. They wrote down some simultaneous equations, solved for national income, and did a bunch of experiments. Paul Samuelson, in a famous 1939 paper, he wrote a difference equation. He tackled dynamics. He said, if you can talk about business cycles, you can't just write down the kinds of equations that Keynes did in his book. You need equations that describe how things evolve over time. So he did. He wrote down a consumption function that had some dynamics. He wrote down a particular kind of investment function, which is actually quite clever because it actually does a good job of fitting data, the accelerator. Keynes did that. And then simultaneously, around the same time, in a League of Nations study, Timbergen wrote down an econometric model, statistical model, and estimated it. Econometric model of the United States. And that eventually that was 1939 or 40, and that led to a bunch of work that actually culminated in Klein and Goldberg's 1955 model of the business cycle. So these people were, thought they were being sympathetic to Keynes and doing what Keynes, what they read Keynes and they said, here's what I think Keynes is saying. And Keynes actually was, he was ambivalent about what they did. He basically, he often said, nice try, but that's not what I meant. So there's a literature that started around, Keynes started it. It's that's not what Keynes meant literature. Keynesian economics is not what Keynes, that's not what Keynes meant. That literature continues to this day. I just read a book by a prominent policymaker in 2020 saying you guys don't know how to read Keynes. Well, whose fault is that? You know, if you read a paper by Arrow or Krebs, if you understand the math, you understand the paper. But Keynes, there's more ambivalence. So there's a bunch of very creative work that was spawned by Keynes and in this line, and Keynes should get a lot of credit for that. Here's another enduring criticism at the time. People like Leontief, a bunch of people made this. The work has the lack of micro foundations. Keynes wrote down these decision rules, and the question is, one thing we can say this is, what questions are Keynes's consumption function, investment function, demand for money function, his decision rules, what questions are those the answers to? He wrote down those are, so, and how would you even sharpen that up? So the first thing is, do they come from some optimum problem? That's the way the impression. Is there an optimum problem? That's the way the impression, the profession, economists, famous economists, what's the optimum problem? Next thing is, do Keynes's guesses, how'd they work on with the actual data? If you actually got some data on his consumption, investment, demand function for money rules, how'd they do? And could you improve them? And then the final thing is, and what is the relationship of Keynes's quote unquote general theory to the general equilibrium theories of Walras and Hicks? In other words, what's his general theory generalizing? You know, if he wants to appeal, you know, compare his endeavor to Einstein, well, Einstein told you exactly. His general theory was generalizing one of the assumptions in his special theory of relativity. What's Keynes doing relative to Walras and Hicks, the classical theory, the so-called classics? That's a good question. So, and the way to think about work after Keynes, the way to organize the discussion is to say, well, they were tackling these questions. And I want to make the remark that these questions are a tribute to Keynes, a compliment. And a thing to note, a principle to take away is good research often frames more good questions than it answers. And Keynes's work did that. So after the war, post-World War II, macroeconomics, what was the research program? What were the questions that were asked, and what was the strategy? And that's what I'm going to try to convey right now. Okay, so I'll break these into several points. The first is, it created started with the work with Timbergen. The part was to invent an econometrics and a statistics, a structural econometrics of simultaneous equations of the kinds Keynes that were lurking in Keynes's book. Simultaneous equations, time series, the kind that Samuelson said you had to look at, cross sections across people to actually figure out what shocks average out and what don't, in order to estimate and evaluate Keynesian decision rules. So that's the invention of much of modern econometrics. And at least half of this, more than half, was motivated by a desire to put Keynesian economics to work in order to do his noble thing of making the government able to prevent recessions from causing the destruction of market economies. So the Coles Commission giants, Hurwitz, my old colleague at Minnesota, a true giant, Challing Koopmans at Yale, who had been at Chicago, Timbergen, Havelmo, they were all motivated by putting statistics and econometrics to work to estimate and evaluate Keynesian decision rules. And they had to invent a magnificent part of statistics that was not present in ordinary statistics. The second thing was this was major, to pose and solve single agent optimum decision problems to find the micro foundations underneath Keynes's decision rules. And you're going to see how these problems were set up. And giants worked on this. So the first is, what question does the consumption function answer? And the two giants that took early answers to that question were Milton Friedman and Franco Modigliani. And then other people like Robert Hall refined their work much further. And that continues to this day. It's very fruitful. So the question is, what do optimum consumption functions look like? If you want to talk about multipliers, Keynesian multipliers, the behavior of consumption functions is critical, what they look like. And so following Friedman, Modigliani, optimum problems, dynamic, stochastic optimum problems have been used as the machine to do that. The investment function. Now this turned out to be very challenging because 25 years after Keynes wrote his general theory, a great economist, Trygve Havelmo, applied to calculus of variations to try to derive the Keynesian investment function. He wrote a book on it, a study in the theory of investment. And what he came up with, he couldn't do it on assumptions that look like Keynes's. He got a demand function for capital, but not for investment. So after Havelmo did that, a big puzzle was, how on earth could we get closer to Keynesian's investment function? By posing an optimum problem. Some very smart people worked on that. Dale Jorgensen and Hall, they got partway, but then the most satisfactory answer to date was discovered by Lucas, Treadway, Gould, and Hayashi by using the dynamics of adjustment costs. You had to have some adjustment costs. And finally, after like 30 or 35 years, somebody discovered a problem that an investment function partially looking like Keynes's actually solved. So now you kind of understood its foundations. The demand for money, giants worked on this. Where does demand for Keynes's demand for money come from? It's a hard problem, and he said some very wise things about it, but he did not have the tools. So people who did have the tools, mainly expected utility theory and a little dynamic optimization, Tobin, Baumol, Markowitz, Samuelson, Robert Merton, they posed portfolio balance problems, and by attacking that problem, they opened up the way to a rich literature on portfolio decision making that goes on to this day. And then the final, these are things that made my list. There's much more. Keynes emphasized, because he was onto and he was struggling this uncertainty about the future. Time and chance played a big role. And you could see Keynes struggling to get a theory about what would happen in the future, and he didn't have one. He basically talked about animal spirits, talked about waves of optimism and pessimism. He thought they had big effects. He kind of made them exogenous, but he kind of, he didn't know what caused them. He said some intriguing things about them that have hints, but he's far short of a theory. This was a loose end in macroeconomics, in big parts of dynamics, until John F. Muth talked about the theory of, the question was, how should you predict the future? Well, Muth knew more about Wiener-Kolmogorov prediction theory than anybody. He was a kid, assistant professor at Carnegie Institute of Technology. So what he said is, well, why not just apply optimum prediction theory to the problems of people who want to predict an uncertain future? Sure, there's a lot of randomness in the future, but let's see what, he said engineers and physicists face similar kinds of randomness, and they have these tools. So he started applying them. So Muth started that, and then Lucas and Prescott picked it up. Muth built on earlier work by Friedman and Nerlov that went only part way because to Muth. They were creeping up on it. They didn't know as much prediction theory as Muth did. So you can see what Muth's using tools that weren't even available to Keynes. So is Tobin. Okay. So what were the tools used? They were the calculus of variations, Wiener-Kolmogorov prediction theory, expected utility theory. And those remain the tools today. They're the tools, and refinements of them are used by young people today to refine the questions and the answers. So let's go back to Keynes. Back to Keynes's response to Marx. So remember, Keynes's response to Marx was, no, the capitalist economy, business cycles do not doom the capitalist economy if wise governments use counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And Keynes, what he wanted to do was use public works, infrastructure projects, time them to fight recessions. That might ring a bell to you all over the world now, from Washington to Beijing. Governments have bought that. This leads me to elaborate on this. Paul Samuelson, you don't hear about this as much as anymore, but you should hear about it. It's Paul Samuelson's neoclassical synthesis. And here's what the principle was. He said, if a government uses Keynesian fiscal and monetary policy to keep an economy close to full employment, then the classical microeconomics of Aura and Marshall applies, and the market economy works well. So that's his refinement, or making kind of more precise Keynes's answer to Marx. It's like, and it also gives a sophisticated version of what does it mean that Keynes had a more general theory than Walrasian, Marshallian general equilibrium theory? Well, it was, it's a patch. It's a patch to classical theory, market clearing, that makes the market clearing work. So I've been told, this is kind of a famous story that you hear from China. Deng Xiaoping's economic advisors had a question to the great American macroeconomist James Tobin when he visited China. Okay, it was a key question. It was, why was Karl Marx wrong about business cycles in market economies? Because Marx said these business cycles are going to get worse and worse and worse, and they were going to bring down market economies. But it hasn't happened. He's right. This question is being asked in the early 1980s. And what was Tobin's answer? He explained the neoclassical synthesis to Deng Xiaoping's advisors, that if you use monetary and fiscal policy, will the market economy do it on its own, with just a agnostic, any kind of macro policy that you could think of? No. But if you use a wise one, then you can keep the economy full to employment. And once you're there, then classical market economy principles for analysis and work, and the economy will perform well. So I love macroeconomics, and I respect the people who've worked in it, the giants. They did intellectually very clever things on an extremely important problem for all of us, about I personally, both of my grandfathers were devastated by the Great Depression. One got up again and one never did. It was very sad. And I saw them, loved them both, but I saw them. So depressions can do really bad things. And what the goal of macroeconomists, the goal of Keynes and Samuelson and the neoclassical things, I view as a noble thing. So the quest continues. These giants who built on Keynes, responded to Keynes, their work was also great in the sense that Keynes was. They left many unanswered questions too, including Muth with rational expectations, including Tobin, his demand for money, including Markowitz. There's so many open questions for refinement. So the quest continues. So here's some of the open questions. What are those aggregate shocks? Do we really have them nailed out? We know things don't average out, but we're still learning about why they don't average out and what those aggregate shocks are. And some smart people have worked on this, continue to work on it. Chris Sims has worked on it, John Cochrane, Lars Hansen, building on Solo's work. But we have to, all these people are humble in saying that this question, that, remember, I start out with a central limit theorem, asking, why don't these, law of large numbers, why don't these shocks average out? And if they don't average out, what are they? Are they real shocks or monetary shocks, financial shocks? We're still learning about that. They are some kind of aggregate shocks. We kind of know that because all business cycles kind of look alike. Similar things happen in all of them. And kind of understanding why, we're still learning about bubbles and incentive problems, insurance. How do you even define a bubble? how do market structures and expectations interact about this? Really smart people are still working on this. Pattern going back to Burns and Mitchell, and the national income measurement. The measurements that macro is built on were done, 90 or 80 or 100 years ago by Burns and Mitchell and Kuznets. In terms of Burns and Mitchell, we have new techniques for pattern recognition, data compression, machine learning. Are there national income accounts that do those measure all the things that we want to measure? Given some of the issues about global warming and things like that, those are key things that young people are appropriately working on. And then an enduring issue, which Keynes was really interested in, is from the beginning, because he was a student and advocate for the post-war World War I great inflations and monetary disturbances and debt problems, debt default problems in Europe. What's the line between monetary and fiscal policy? Can you even tell the difference? It's a line that's always being stressed. It's arbitrary. Keynes and Friedman put us on the path to kind of studying that. But today in 2020, with the latest macro shocks we have, are monetary and fiscal policy a team, or are they separate? And finally, I think in the best tradition that continues, using work about in the neoclassical synthesis tradition is a great economist and a great public servant, Ben Bernanke. His American Economic Association presidential address that's just come out is talking about how to use serious macroeconomic models to study, augment, and innovate the tools that monetary and fiscal authorities have to continue Keynes and Tobin's quest and Samuelson's quest to make the neoclassical synthesis a continuing reality.